Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to Session 1A of the course Principles of Instructional Design. In Session 1A, let's get an introduction to interface design. In Session 1A, let's begin by defining interface and interface design. Let's consider the elements of an effective interface. Let's look at the ISO standards for interfaces. And then be sure to check out Session 1B, in which we'll finish the topic by looking at color and also gain an overview of the assignments and activities for this week's session. Here is the official course description for our graduate course. The bottom line is that this course introduces you to the procedures that are used to create effective computer-based interface and screen designs. So let's start by defining what is an interface. Merriam-Webster defined interface as the place at which independent and often unrelated systems meet and they act on or communicate with each other, or also the means by which this interaction or communication is achieved at an interface point. When you look up interface design on Wikipedia, they describe it as the process for developing a method for two or more modules in a system for them to communicate and to connect. What I like here is that Wikipedia points out that these modules can apply to hardware, to software, or any place in which a user and some device come together. That is interface design. So let's think for a moment. Where do you interface with technology? Now we'll look at this a little more formally in a discussion on a discussion board to debrief after this session on Blackboard. But where do you interface with technology? What kind of challenges do you encounter when you're interfacing with different devices? So what I'd like to do here is just expand your thoughts for a moment. Many of us will be educators who are taking this course, but not all necessarily. But when you look at it, all people interface with technology in a number of different places. So technology is not just the phone and the computer and an iPad and so on, tablet device. But think about your alarm clock. Think about your washing machine. Think about your car. What types of things do you encounter when you're there? When we're talking about interface design, we're talking about looking at these kinds of places, any place where a human and some technology come together and try to make that more comfortable, more user-friendly, more effective. In his seminal work on the topic of designing appropriate and effective interfaces, Brown, 1988, to show you how far back these thoughts go, his work is still considered a seminal foundational work in this field. He refers to interface design as the process of designing an efficient and an effective human-computer interaction. Now, how do you achieve that? Or why do you do that? Well, number one, Brown says to reduce the mental processing operations so that you can use the tool seamlessly. So you don't have to think about how do you use the tool. You just start using the tool. And related to that, Brown says that using the tool, the interface should be intuitive. So in other words, you should be able to just figure it out with very little time. There should be a very small learning curve, so your cognitive activity will not have to be focused on how to make the tool work or what it's supposed to do or how you can accomplish those things. It should be intuitive, and it should reduce the amount of mental energy that you have to put into it. Raskin, in writing the Humane Interface, looked at two laws of user interface design, and he based these on the fictional laws of robotics that were proposed by Isaac Asimov. He says the first law in creating a good interface is that a computer shall not harm your work or through inactivity allow your work to come to any harm. The second law is the computer should not waste your time or should not require you to do more work that's necessary. So if you think about it, this is kind of saying what Brown was saying. Small mental cognitive load, and it should be efficient and intuitive. Following this session, we'll look at some of these questions on a discussion board. Think about and reflect on, where do your students encounter challenges when they are interfacing with technology? Also, what kinds of problems do you or your students find when you're using various media? What do you encounter when you're using different web pages or different educational software or apps, or just using productivity software such as word processing and slide presentations, or if you're using tools like Promethean Smartboard activities or PowerPoint? Another important consideration when designing interfaces for the classroom is, what kinds of difficulties do students with disabilities encounter when they're interfacing with technology? So we'll have a time to reflect on this through a discussion board. But start thinking, what do you encounter? What do your students encounter? Because we'd first like to identify some of these issues. We'd like to look at some principles of how to design interfaces better, so that ultimately we can meet up with the rules of Brown and some of the other folks that we're going to take a look at as well. Brown, with his first work in 1988 and furthering his work and updating in 1999, talked about effective interfaces consisting of 5 different elements. Let's briefly take a look at those elements. The first element he suggests is consistency. In other words, when a user looks at any type of technology in any form, is it consistent? Well, in terms of technology and screens, we're looking at consistency in terms of things like font sizes. Navigation should be, the scheme used should be the same throughout the entire program or the application. How are colors used and backgrounds? Are sounds used consistently? Are the designs of the individual screens consistent? When you look at it, Brown is suggesting that consistency makes the user feel more prepared to go through that particular app, and also it's more comfortable for the user because he or she knows what to expect as they proceed through. If you are an educator, you're probably already aware of the importance of using analogies when you're teaching. Brown suggests that designers can capitalize on the learner's previous understanding of something and then utilize that to provide that consistency and the overall understanding of that application. Further, if you create an overall organizing physical analogy, we refer to that as a metaphor for the interface. Metaphors for an overall interface are very powerful because they can take something that's abstract and make it concrete. They can create familiarity for that user, for that learner. They can also tap into the emotions and the motivation level of the student, of the learner. They can draw users' attention. They can also motivate the user into action by drawing them into that situation. Think of the many metaphors that you encounter both in software apps as well as different websites. For example, an overall organizing theme that many people are familiar with is the Windows desktop, or the desktop on in different platforms. Magnifying glass, which we universally figure will mean to somehow to zoom in and enlarge the picture that we're seeing on the screen. Folder icons. When you see a folder, you know that that's going to be a container of different types of files or different documents. Sometimes binoculars are used to find things, or a question mark. Web documents and different tools that turn pages like a book. And also a trash can. When you see a trash can, you know what that tool is going to do. Then it's a matter of seeing, do you drag things to the trash or do you click on the trash? But by seeing that overall metaphor, it reduces a lot of cognitive load. You have expectations for what that tool is going to provide for you. One part of being an effective designer of any kind of application is to be aware of your audience. In the Misericordia graduate course, Instructional Design, we spend some time looking at audience or learner analysis. Here in Brown's third element of an effective interface, Brown states that expectations and population stereotypes need to be considered. In other words, different groups of students or different people, whether you're doing training or if you're doing K-12 education, those audiences, those groups are going to have different expectations and understandings based on their personal experience. For example, if you're dealing with 16, 17-year-olds, you find that a lot of them are learning to drive. So they understand the colors of red, yellow, and green to hold certain meanings. For many people, the color red has a meaning of danger or alert or alarm. But yet, if you're doing training in the electric power industry, they view red as meaning the circuit is good, power is flowing, red is good. So a designer needs to be very familiar with the intended audience in order to utilize elements in an effective way that will speak to the understandings and the expectations of that particular audience. Brown's fourth element is ease of learning, ease of use, functionality. So when he's talking about ease of learning, as you could predict, he's talking about how quickly the user can become proficient with using that product. How can they learn it quickly? Again, not the content of the product, but rather how to use it, how to navigate it, how efficiently can they get in there to use it. And functionality refers to the capabilities that the interface affords to the user. In other words, you want to have ideally an interface that provides a lot of functionality, but is easy to learn and intuitive. So remember that an interface does not have to give up functionality in order to be easy to learn or easy to use. Now this applies everywhere. For example, recently my wife and I rented a U-Haul truck, and we were moving some furniture. As I looked at the interface on the dashboard, there were not a lot of words on there, and most things we have come to understand, and some of them are very intuitive, like wipers and turn signals and window washer and so on. In this particular truck, there were 5 buttons on the left-hand side, the far left-hand side of the dashboard, and I had no idea what they were. There was no instruction. One of them, for example, was a check mark. Now, in a truck, what in the world does a check mark button do? I couldn't determine it. And because of that, I was afraid to use it because I didn't want to have the furniture kind of blow out the back of the truck. So realize that these elements of an effective interface apply to any place that a user and some form of technology work together. They come together. Brown's fifth element and final element is to provide multiple paths through the material. Now, this is not an essential, but it's something that's ideal. If a designer builds in multiple ways to navigate through the same material, a designer could provide for maybe different levels of, of previous understanding of the material, or people who have different reasons for using that material. Maybe they need an introduction. Maybe they need enrichment. Maybe they really need to fully learn this material because they have no prior knowledge, or they may need to just get some remediation. So this is not an essential, but it is a nice thing to be able to add in, again, if appropriate, and if possible, with that particular content in that particular medium. An organization called ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization that's used in corporations, has set forth different standards for standardizing interfaces and making them more user-friendly. Let's briefly take a look through their lens at good interface design. The ISO talks about the goal of the designer as to create a user-centered design. In other words, something that is simple to use, it's efficient, and it allows the user to accomplish his or her goals without drawing unnecessary attention to itself. In other words, it's seamless, and this also harkens back to Brown's two rules. The ISO then goes on to describe some particulars to consider when organizing information on an interface. They talk about clarity. Is the information clear to the user? Can it be distinguished accurately? Is it concise and the user's not overloaded with extra things? Is it consistent? That goes back to Brown. Is it consistent, and can we see the same elements in use in the same way in different parts of the product? Can the user be directed towards what's required? Is it easy to read? Is it comprehensible? Is it easy to understand and to recognize and unambiguous? The ISO goes on to provide different recommendations, again, very specific recommendations on what makes good guidance for a user who's interfacing with some technology product. First, they talk about prompts. Is it clear where to click or what to type in or how to type something in? Think about, for example, when you're typing in like your phone number or your credit card number, on whatever interface you're facing at the time. Do you type in dashes? Do they want no dashes? Is there something else that they want? Is there an example of that? So that would be an example of very explicit prompts. Does the system give good feedback to the user? Is there information about the status of what's going on? Is the user kind of left hanging and in a state of confusion as to what's happening? Sometimes we experience this with different devices. For example, if you're a Windows PC user, when Windows is updating, sometimes the screen goes to black and you don't see anything. Am I supposed to do something? Did it shut off? Do I have to restart it? Sometimes the user gets nervous. There's not enough status information. There's not enough feedback at that point for the user to make good, informed decisions. And finally, with regard to interfaces, the ISO talks about error management. How does the interface handle error prevention, the correcting of errors, and support the user in terms of there's an error here and how we're going to handle that. And also, do they provide some type of help system to provide specific information that's context sensitive and not just hurl you into some help file that is maybe nowhere near where you're at. It's not specific enough for you. So to briefly summarize, in this session we defined interface, we identified different challenges, or at least started to introduce the thoughts of challenges with various interfaces. We considered elements of an effective interface. We looked at Brown, and we looked at the ISO, and we looked at user-centered design. So having had this introduction, be sure to view the second part of class session number 1, in which we get into more specifics and we deal with color. See you there.